to the National World War II Museum and today's Lunchbox lecture. I am Dr. Maggie Hartley, Director of Public Engagement for the museum, and I am so excited that you guys have joined us for today's program. Before we get started, we do have a brief message from our sponsor, AARP Louisiana.
Hello, I'm Joanne Jenkins, Chief Executive Officer of AARP, America's largest membership organization serving people aged 50 and over. With more than 5 million of our 38 million members currently or previously having served in the military, we're in a mission to support veterans and military families. That's why we've created a wide range of free resources, tools, and community programs to help veterans and military families navigate their options and meet challenges head-on. We've developed a job board that directly connects veterans and military spouses to employers wanting to hire them. And we have free resources that provide some military structure to starting a business. We know that when you're a military veteran caregiver, you start younger, care longer, and face many unique challenges. That's why AARP provides a free military caregiving guide containing important and timely information that you truly need. Because military veterans or service members are twice as likely to be a target for fraud, the AARP Fraud Watch Network, in partnership with Operation Protect Veterans, provides free action alerts detailing the latest scams directed at veterans and military families. And through our state offices nationwide, AARP can help you find the right opportunity to give back to your community and fellow veterans. To learn more about these and other resources, visit aarp.org/veterans. Thank you.
So again, thank you to AARP Louisiana for their continued support of our public programs, not just our Lunchbox lectures, but our annual commemorations as well, which, as many of you know, are coming up this month in May. So without further ado, I'm going to get ready to turn this over to the National World War II Museum's World War II military historian within the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, Dr. John Curatola. He's going to be here to talk with us a little bit more about nose art in World War II. So let's welcome John to the stage.
Sorry. Thank you, Maggie. Appreciate it. Yeah, as Maggie's told you, it's kind of weird. Lieutenant Colonel USMC. Yes, I'm a Marine who used to work for the Army, who studies the Air Force. So I've got the entire field covered here. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that is really my most favorite topic of being a historian. I really do. I love nose art. I love airplanes. And so be able to merge these two together and get paid to do it, it's just a great gig. I can't believe my luck. But what we're going to do, we're going to talk about nose art in the Second World War specifically, and again, I'm going to depict it in its original form. Okay, men for millennia, warriors for millennia, I should say, have adorned their equipment, their arms, their armor with personal attributes, symbols, mythologies, paint, those kinds of things. And nose art is just the natural continuation of that. Thing is, the canvas has got much bigger on the side of an airplane. So that's what you're seeing here is expressions of men in war, their concerns, and today we're going to talk about some of the general themes. Now, having been a historian for the past 15 years, the idea here is that humans have patterns, but there's always outliers. I'm only going to talk about the patterns of nose art because there's always an exception to, a rule you put out there. So I'm going to just show you some of the regular practices with regard to the influences of nose art and some of the national trends, because each nation, major combatant in the Second War, kind of took a different tack with regard to how they depicted art on their aircraft. So we're going to start off with that. So again, we'll talk about some of the basic elements of nose art, the influences, the trends, the general themes, and I'll go into some specifics. This particular P-51 that you see here right now with the Ding Hao, which that probably doesn't mean anything to you, but in Chinese it means excellent or thumbs up. And this was a plane of a guy by the name of James Howard, who flew in both the Pacific and the European theaters. As you can see, he's got both Japanese and German kill marking on his P-51B here. He's actually the only fighter pilot in the 8th Air Force to get a Medal of Honor. for his exploits in fighting off a German attack against a B-17 formation. But here you see a nice, depiction of, one form of nose art. Now, as we see, nose art, it has a very broad definition. Usually involves a picture sometimes. It doesn't have to. Usually, or a name of the airplane, or it can show kill markings or victories over other planes, or the kinds of missions that pilot or that crew has flown, or number of fighter sweeps. For example, in this P-38, you can see it says, Lucky Lady on it, and you can see he's got 2 swastikas indicating he's got 2 kills. He's killed 2 German aircraft. And then you see this blackboard where he has top hats with like a cane. Those are escort missions. That's how he identifies those. And then we'll have ones with a broom, which stands for a fighter sweep. And so these have little codes. They mean things. To the outside observer, you're like, that's kind of weird. But they actually mean things to the crewmen. And we'll talk more about this as we go along. Okay. And sometimes not even on the tail or on the front of the airplane. It's on the tail of the airplane or even on the side of the fuselage. So when I say nose art, I'm using a very general term. I'm talking about art that goes all over the airplane. There is an actual aircraft, and you can go look it up yourself. It's a B-24, and it's called The Dragon and His Tail. And it's done by a staff sergeant named Sarkis Bardigan. And the tail of the Dragon goes all the way from the front of the aircraft all the way to the very back of the aircraft. It's a phenomenal piece of art. I urge you to go look it up once you're done today, to look up The Dragon and His Tail. It's a beautiful aircraft. But anyway, it doesn't necessarily have to be on the nose. And here you can see this naval aviator actually has kill markings on the tail of his F-4F Wildcat. And here's some Aussie soldiers obviously putting some artwork on their tails. Now, some of the trends that we see with regard to artwork, and we see here patriotism, popular culture, unit pride, or individual expression, which the Air Corps is kind of known for this individual expression piece on it. This P-47 you see here has an ironic twist to it. It's got Donald Duck, behind bars in a loose stalag as a prisoner of war and saying, I wanted wings. This kind of ironic approach to warfare. And of course, many of the arts that we see are focused upon women. These are men in combat, deployed from their families and their wives, and obviously women play a very large role. And we'll talk about later on the percentages that we see with regard to nose art and their depictions at the very end here. But I like this description of why you see so much nose art. Vents for aggressive feelings created by the tension arising from the confliction of civilian and military values. Most of these men were drafted. Okay? Outside, any outlets for expression or releasing tension by way of loopholes in military regulation were used to their fullest capacity. Kind of thumb in your nose, at the man, if you want to use that term. Now, the Army Air Corps did actually put out regulations as late as 1944 endorsing or encouraging nose art as a way to kind of build morale. And so, like most men or soldiers, they're going to take that to the extreme. Now, again, we're going to talk about some general trends here, but you can see here on the nose, on the top of the place, on the very top here, the P-51, it says plastered bastard, if you can't read it. And then, of course, son of Satan, this kind of individual, devil-may-care, kind of thumbing their nose thing is a constant you see in a lot of the nose art depictions of today, or that we see then. Also, obviously, the female form. Men in combat who've been deployed from their families, and a lot of them are using Alberto Vargas, who most of you are probably familiar with, the Vargas girls. In the 1940s, if you go down to the D-Day exhibit, you'll see a whole wall that they have of artwork, and his idealized forms of the female body were plastered all over. Quonset huts in the 8th Air Force, 5th Air Force, all over the world. And of course, it made its way onto the sides of aircraft. And so his influence was also a contributing factor to many of the forms that you see on the sides of these aircraft today. In addition to him, a guy named Gil Elvgren, who is called the King of Cheesecake, okay? And he is a graphic artist who used to work for the Saturday Evening Post. He also did some other freelance work, and you've seen his work on a lot of like tool calendars in the 1950s, or auto parts store calendars, and he had these very idealized depictions of women that were also influential during the war itself. And of course, Disney. and Looney Tunes, cartoons themselves. If you go downstairs, obviously, our display on Walt Disney echoes this sentiment. You can see here Dumbo and Bugs Bunny and Snow White, and up here Daffy Duck. Its nose art is replete with these characters, and of course, in concert with downstairs, they endorsed this. This was something that Disney contributed to, and willfully did so, to kind of raise the morale of troops overseas. Also, Al Cap. Those of you who remember the Little Abner comic strip, back we had comic strips back in the day when you read newspapers and stuff like that. Dog Patch and Little Abner was an important popular manifestation. You can see here Daisy May there on this nose of a B-24. And this lady here, Miss Lace, okay, she was a depiction that was created by Milt Caniff, and she hosted she didn't, obviously Milt Caniff hosted it, but had a cartoon strip called Mail Call, M-A-L-E-C-A-L-L, and she kind of served as a beacon for individual soldiers. She was not big on officers. She liked privates and lower-ranking men, and a lot of men identified with her as an idealized female form. And you will see her form, Miss Lace, in a number of theaters because she was so popular with the younger troops or the junior troops. Also, you see a lot of military themes, things that are reflective of the fact that they are actually now in the military itself. As you can see here, Off Limits. My godfather was a B-17 pilot during the war, and his aircraft was named Off Limits. That's not his, but again, these are constant themes that you see all along. The plane that you see up top here, Pete the Palm Inspector, you're like, well, what does PALM stand for? Program for Overseas Movement. It was, every unit had to go through an inspection before they could actually go overseas to make sure that they had all their gear and they were ready to go. And so it was a big deal to be able to pass your PALM inspection. And so obviously they're reflecting this requirement to have this inspection before you went overseas. Obviously General Ike is one. And there's also one, if you can go online yourself and look it up, there's one called Ruby. And what it was they actually had a contest in the UK over which was the prettiest woman's Army Air Force auxiliary that was there in England. And they all voted, and they picked this one Army Air Corps woman named Ruby, and there's actually a B-17 with her likeness on it. So again, these ideas of the fact that they're in the military, their nose art will reflect some of these ideas and themes of these men engaged. Geography, where they came from. Up top, you see Georgia Rebel 2, Windy City Challenger, Salt Lake Katy, Kentucky Babe. You also see a lot of states or regions coming forward as representatives of the crew themselves. Now, you might want to ask, well, who picked the name? How did they get a name like that? Well, a lot of times, it would be the crew working together, determining what the theme may be. A lot of times, it would focus on the pilot himself or a certain member of the crew who was rather unique or unusual. And certainly, the individual, like the single-engine aircraft, obviously the pilot has something to say about that because there's only one person in that. So the bomber crews themselves, there was kind of a mishmash in how they determined what the nose would look like. And oh, by the way, just because your aircraft was named Kentucky Babe and you flew it over, it doesn't mean you're flying it every day. It's not your plane. They need airplanes. Some of the crew might be flying it that day, so it doesn't necessarily belong to you. And a lot of times, names would actually change. Hey, we got a new crew. That crew went home. They did their 25 missions, bring in a new crew. Oh, new plane. Hey, paint that nose art over. We're going to name it something else. That also happens. So it's a fluid thing as well. It isn't etched in stone. And also, there's kind of some humor to it. Bucket of bolts, as they refer to their own airplane, kind of tongue-in-cheek. Gremlin Gus, for those of you who aren't familiar, Gremlin, just like the movie back in the 80s, those little things that make things go haywire. Well, obviously in an airplane, it's very easy for something to go wrong. There's lots of gremlins, lots of gripes that you would have in a given airplane. So they're kind of tongue-in-cheeking on Gremlin Gus or Tailwind, and you can see they're talking about, obviously, something that's very good for navigation. It helps your air or your ground track, but obviously they kind of threw in the female form as part of the aviation theme there. And we talked about mission sets when we first started, that picture here. Here you see California Cutie, which is a P-38, and you can see he's got the top hats for the escort missions. He's got umbrella when he's providing top cover for bombers that are going in. He's got bomb missions he's actually flown. And then over here you see the fighter sweeps. So this particular depiction tells you a lot about what this pilot's been doing and the types of missions that he's been involved in during this campaign. Same thing over on this P-51B. You can see not only has he done fighter sweeps and bombers, but he's also took out a train. He's claiming they took out a train. That's why there's a choo-choo on there. And he's got some trucks that he's probably strafed, and then some troop formations. Because remember, it's not just about the strategic bombing campaign. The 9th Air Force, specifically in Europe, and the 5th Air Force in the Pacific are actually attacking ground targets in support of, say, Patton's Third Army or MacArthur's drive up the island chains. And so we have to keep in mind that it isn't just about strategic bombing, but there's a lot of tactical aviation going on and doing low-level work. And that's what these are kind of representing. They're strafing enemy formations and assets on the ground. Okay. This B-17 here is kind of interesting. You can see it's got all these bombing missions it's gone on, but then it's also attacked some ships, and it's claiming some aircraft. Now, what the hearts mean, I have no idea. I've tried to find out what that, maybe they broke some hearts when they left. I absolutely do not know. So this is one of those times where you kind of have to really get with the unit and find out why they depicted the way it did. But again, it tells a story in and of itself. And the crew. Talked about how do they pick a name. This particular B-29 was called Waddy's Wagon. It's named after the pilot. He was at University of Oklahoma football player, All-American actually, who joins the Army Air Corps and becomes a B-29 pilot. And you can see here that he has the members of his crew, and you have a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, a bombardier, and all your gunners. And they're all kind of depicting themselves, in this cartoonish figure with their figures in the front of the B-29. So it's a great picture to kind of show the hijinks that goes on in these environments, during the Second World War. Unfortunately, Waddy and his crew went down over Japan in 1945. Also over here, we see Dry Martini and the Cocktail Kids. The pilot of that last name was Martini. And so, in the B-17 usually had about 10 people on it, so obviously it bears fruit that it works out with the Cocktail Kids. Now notice, on this one, it says the fourth iteration of the nose art. And you see this happen a lot too, where pilots or crews flew an airplane, lost it for whatever reason, maybe it was written off or damaged, and they'll rename the same name again, but they'll put a second on it or a third on it to keep that lineage going. Now, this particular plane here, Dry Martini, was in the 305th Bomb Group. Now, I know it doesn't mean anything to you, but the guy who was in charge of the 305th Bomb Group was a guy by the name of Curtis LeMay. This was actually his unit. And it was within this unit itself that they start experimenting with a number of applications for strategic bombing, i.e. staying in formation over the target, not deviating over the bomb run. And when they get a new commander, a guy by the name of Haywood Hansel, who helped frame the idea of strategic bombardment, he had never actually executed it, but when he shows up in Europe to actually participate, he flies in Dry Martini for his first few missions to kind of learn what it is really like. So the plane itself has a lot of history behind it. And of course, victory tallies. How many aircraft did you shoot down? And again, claims can vary, but you can see this is a nice way for a pilot to identify with his victories and kind of show his contribution to the war effort. And of course, he's become great for the press. You want individual heroes, you want to show, this idea that we're defeating the Germans or the Nazis. Here we actually have a Polish officer who's fighting with the RAF, because Poland obviously was occupied. So many Polish officers and air crewmen went to the Royal Air Force, and they flew with the Royal Air Force even during the Battle of Britain and then subsequent to summer 1940. So you can see that this helps depict, their victories, and some of them even go so far here with Robert Johnson, he's even got the kind of aircraft that he shot down, FW-190, ME-109, to kind of have a track record of every plane that he shot down. Gabi Gabreski in the middle is the highest scoring pilot in the European theater of operation. He does the same thing. You can see he's identified ME-109s or ME-110s. He will actually come back, or he will stay in the Air Force. He would become an ace in the Korean War, shooting down 7 MiGs during that campaign. So he's an ace in 2 wars. On top is Alex Verasiu, who was in the Marianas Turkey shoot. He shoots down like 5 Japanese in one mission. It's crazy during the Marianas Turkey shoot. And he shoots down even more Japanese aircraft and claims victories for strafing as well. So that's his scoreboard, looks as impressive as it is. And this one's a great story. I'll let you look at that for a second. What's wrong with this picture? Yeah. Not only is he one of the very few pilots that have shot down a Japanese, a German, and an Italian aircraft, he's one of 3 pilots who actually shot down 3 Axis aircraft from the individual countries, but he actually shot down an American. It's a true story. And he actually got a Distinguished Flying Cross for it. I'll tell you the story. He's actually flying a fighter mission out of Luzon, which is in the Philippines, and they're going to go recon where they think a Japanese airstrip is in Formosa or modern-day Taiwan. They don't find anything, but they come back, and they actually see a Japanese airfield and some fighters scramble, and there's a little melee, and some aircraft are shot down, to include one of his wingmen, who goes into the drink. So he stays orbiting around the wingman, making radio calls to make sure that there's some rescue coming, and so he's not alone. And the wingman's in his raft. Well, as he's doing this, a C-47, which is a U.S. Army Air Corps cargo aircraft, or paratroopers would jump out of it, we have one in the foyer, is flying into the area. And it sees this airfield that the Japanese had taken off, and it's setting up for a landing on this runway. And of course, Curtis knows, hey, that's a Japanese airfield. So he's trying to get the pilot on the radio. He's trying all the frequencies, and he can't get anything. Then he tries to cut the airplane up, cutting him off in his path, flying in front of him to deter him from landing on a Japanese airfield, and he's not getting any response. So finally, he lines up behind the right engine and fires into it, sets it on fire, and the plane ditches in the ocean. All the passengers get out and get on 2 rafts, and they actually hook up with the aviator that was in the area that he was flying over. They all get together, and Curtis drops a note to the 2 rafts and said, Japs on the island, don't go there. And of course, they realized what was happening. But what's even better about this story is not only did they get Distinguished Flying Cross for that, but he sees them, when he gets back, he sees them manifest for who was on the airplane. And one of them was the nurse he dated the night before. So it's a great story. It's a great story. Yeah. And of course, the girl back home. Obviously something popular for men in combat to remember. The one you see up top, hurry home, honey, that particular pilot, that's how his wife would end every letter. And so he reflected it in the nose art. Marge Valenhall here, this is Richard Bong, the top American A, shot down 40 Japanese in the Pacific Theater. This is his girlfriend, then wife, and then he died shortly after the war, test flying a P-80. But this was his aircraft, Marge. I love this one here. This particular pilot was married to a woman named Sally, short fuse Sally. Well, during the war, him and his wife part ways. So his nose art changes, and later versions you see it just says short fuse. Sally's gone at this point. Yeah. And of course, you've seen the Memphis Belle, you've seen the movie, you're familiar with it. Obviously, the pilot of Memphis Belle was dating a woman during that time when they first deployed. She was from Memphis, and so you can see the Vargas Girl influence here. So that's what they named it. After he finished his 25 missions, he went home on a public relations tour. He was very popular, and that relationship went by the wayside. So when he went to the Pacific, his next plane was not called Memphis Belle, it was something else. So again, nice story to tell. Also, if you look on the scoreboard here, you can see they got the bombing missions and some swastikas. And you can probably make it out from where you're at. On top of some of the bombing missions, you see stars on top of the bombing missions. What does that mean? That means if they were the lead bomber for the squadron or the lead bomber for the group, meaning they're the ones who are looking for the target, they're the one everybody else was following. That's a very important responsibility on a bombing mission. So they're actually annotating, we were the lead during these particular missions. That's what those stars mean. And they're either red or they're yellow. And for the artists themselves, think about it. I've been talking about how beautiful these pieces of art are, but the artists themselves are the one who have the skills. And of course, here you go. It's the way you got us some duty, for a lot of these guys. And I talked about how nose art comes, how do crews pick what they want to do. Well, here's a nice depiction of it. So it's a way to make a buck. And, oh, by the way, we got a lot of beer out of it. So again, these are some quotes from artists that were there. And you get a lot of duty, too. Now, let's talk about some national trends. And there are. And again, I'm just going to talk about trends because there's always exceptions to every rule between the Germans, the Russians, the Japanese, and, of course, the Americans and the British. There are some trends that you see emerge over time during the war itself. Now, the British and the UK are pretty similar. Mom and dad, apple pie, the girl back home, and the female form are very popular with both the U.S. And British troops, as well as, obviously, Mickey Mouse. Again, we all kind of think alike with our Anglo brethren. So the representations you see on RAF, Royal Air Force aircraft, and the U.S. aircraft are pretty similar. This particular one is rather interesting. You see the boot kicking Hitler in the butt. Why this is an interesting picture, it says 242. That's 242 Squadron. And it's in charge, under command of this gentleman right here, who some of you may or not have heard. His name is Douglas Bader. Douglas Bader had no legs. He was an RAF pilot before the war. And he's kind of a daredevil pilot, and he doesn't follow all the safety rules, and he gets in a crash in the 1930s, and he loses his legs below the knee. And the RAF cashiers him out of the Royal Air Force. Well, they're in such dire need of pilots when the war starts that he has 10 legs made, and they let him come back into the RAF. And he actually becomes one of the most successful fighter pilots and squadron commanders in the Royal Air Force until he was shot down or collided with another plane or shot down. We don't know. We can't figure that one out. Around 1940. Now, there's more to the story here. Not only does he not have legs, but he's an exceptional pilot. When he bails out of his aircraft, well, he leaves one of his legs in the cockpit, okay? So he's got a problem. So when the Germans pick him up, they know who he is, and they kind of wine and dine him. There's kind of a chivalrous thing here going on. And they radio the British and say, hey, we have Douglas Bader. He needs some legs. So the British go, roger that. And so the Germans allow a plane to fly over and drop some legs so Douglas Bader can actually walk around. Now, I'm not making this stuff up. This is a true story. Now, there's more to the story. So he has a good time with the German squadron. Well, they send him, to a Luftstalag or prisoner of war camp. The problem is he keeps trying to escape. So what do the Germans do? Take away his legs. There you go. So it's a great personal story of desire and resistance on the part of Douglas Bader. And he survives the war and is really quite a legend in the Royal Air Force. Okay. Now, the Navy had specific rules against nose art. We all know better. The further away you are from the flagpole, right, the further you are maybe to kind of skirt, the requirements or the mandates. And so you can see here you have some Navy aircraft. And I usually think that the Navy aircraft are pretty boring, but once you start really looking into them and you see most of the Navy aircraft that are ground-based, you see a lot of this. Not so much on the aircraft carriers because they're near the flagpole, the admirals there, that kind of stuff. But you do see it on a lot of the ground-based aircraft more and more. I found this both the Navy and the Marine Corps itself. Now you can see the plane up here. It's got some nose art on it. It's got a skull and crossbones. That's the unit insignia for a Navy fighter squadron. And again, you don't see a lot of that in the Navy per se, but there are instances where they certainly do that. They skirt the requirements. The Germans don't do a lot of nose art. Again, I'm giving you general trends here. What you do see a lot from the Germans are on their noses squadron insignia or group insignia, identifying the unit that they're flying with. You don't see a lot of the girls or, mom and country or, for fascism. You don't see a lot of that kind of stuff on their nose art, just the unit insignias for the most part. But one thing the German, and you can see here, here's more depictions of the units themselves, a night fighter unit there, JG-1, fighter interceptor units. Again, that's pretty much the extent. But one thing the Germans do that's really unique and interesting is, remember I showed you the scoreboard for the Americans. You got it on your side, and you're sitting in your cockpit, and you got your hero photograph, sitting in your cockpit. The Germans do something a little bit different. They put them on the tails. So German kill markings are on the rudders of their aircraft or on the vertical stabilizers, depending on the airplane itself. It kind of depends. But they keep the tallies here on the tail, and in many instances, they will put the national insignia of the plane they shot down, British, American, French for that matter, and in some instances will also, like the Americans do, I shot down a Spitfire, and they'll put Spitfire or P-51, they'll put that underneath them. And what's also interesting is, in this particular picture you see here, this guy said he shot down at least 100 aircraft. Okay? But then you notice this wreath and this cross here underneath the wreath. In the German military, you had the Iron Cross, which we're pretty familiar with, but they had another medal above that called the Knight's Cross, and it was worn at the throat. It was like the second step up, because you had the Deutsches Cross over here. But if you got the Knight's Cross, it was a big deal. Kind of like getting a Distinguished Service Cross or Navy Cross in the military, in the U.S. military. And it had 3 different degrees to it. You had the Knight's Cross with a wreath, with swords, and with diamonds. It had 3 iterations. This pilot here is telling you not only did he get the Knight's Cross, but he got one with the wreath. So it's second. And then if he kills more, he'll get what's called the swords, and they'll add swords onto it. And then if it gets diamonds, well, then they try to make bling on it. I don't know. I haven't seen very many of those. But you can see here he's telling you, I have the oak leaves and Knight's Cross with oak leaves. So it's really kind of an interesting manifestation. Okay? The Russians, they have real interesting nose art. You don't see a lot of the cheesecake and the girls. What you do see in a lot of the Russian aircraft are these patriotic tones. This says, for the fatherland. Or you'll see ones that say, for the Constitution, or for Stalin, or for the glorious cause. It's usually very politically centric or centered on the homeland, for the motherland, or those kinds of things. You see this replete in Russian aircraft. But they also did do kill markings, and you can see here, and they put them all over. Fuselage, tail, kind of wherever they wanted to put them, on the nose. So they really don't have a standard in that regard, but they do indeed do kill markings. This particular pilot here, and you can't see the nose art, Pete, says the pilot's name, and it says his tally of fascists. Okay. So again, getting that political piece that the Russians are famous for. And here you can see he's got on the side of his fuselage, up there again. And notice they also put, because the Russians will give awards to inanimate objects, like airplanes and people. And you can see they're showing, this pilot has gotten 3 heroes of the Soviet Union, so they're also showing awards that they've received on top of the aircraft kills themselves. Well, the Japanese don't do a lot of nose art. What you do see with the Japanese are these very colorful tail codes or colorful geometric shapes. Look at the tail here of these aircraft or on the fuselage themselves that designate a particular unit. So you don't see, for the emperor or those kinds of things. You see these really, some of them are very intricate designs. Some of them will actually go the entire span of the fuselage. As the war progresses, you're going to see a lot more of these kind of ornate tail codes that the Japanese use, but not a lot of individuality. And here's why. For those of you having spent 4 years in Asia, the community is more important than the individual, as opposed to a Western idea where the individual rights and stuff prevail. It's a different mindset. And so you don't see that individually really reflected in their aircraft like you would see in a Western model. So it's kind of a reflection of society as a whole. Now, having said that, they actually do some kill markings, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But here you can see some more of the tail codes that you see here, and this kind of Z thing I think is kind of cool. This tail is actually, if it was a color, this is red with a white Z, and these stars are yellow. They're very bright, really kind of cool. And then this stripe, there's a white stripe, then there's a red stripe that goes down the front of the aircraft too. So they're very colorful in that regard. But they do some kill markings. You can see here's a Japanese Zero, and he's got 3 chrysanthemums. They're saying, I got three kills. And then you have some pilots here that are actually putting kill markings on the fuselage. Why you don't see this for a couple of reasons. Again, the Japanese looking at the collective as opposed to the individual. Also, the Japanese military is very hierarchical. Not like all militaries aren't, but they're very hierarchical. So if I was a first lieutenant and my CEO was a captain, it's bad form for me to have more kills on my plane than my boss. So they're a little reticent to do that. What they will do, and as you see in this one, it isn't necessarily the pilot, but it's the plane that they're assigning the kills to, if that makes sense to you. Again, the collective idea kind of manifests itself in the way they adorn their aircraft with some of the kill markings. And we'll talk about some of the general themes that we see here. Shark mouths, you bet, all over the place. Everybody uses them. Russians have them, the Germans have them, the British have them, the Americans have them. And the reason why I have this picture up, you can see obviously the Flying Tigers, P-40. What I like about it is look at the corners of the tiger's mouth. They don't match. What that means is they took this cowling from another airplane and slapped it onto this one because they needed the parts. Again, these are units that are engaged in combat. You don't always have everything you need. Everything's not neat and orderly. And so here you have a kind of a mismatch of nose art. Nose art from one plane doesn't necessarily fit with this particular part from another P-4. That's why I kind of like this picture. Kind of shows the reality of war and how messy it can be. Okay? Heavenly body, this particular indication of this woman kind of floating, you will see many aircraft with this particular form adorning its nose. And it's a Vargas girl manifestation as well. Not only will you see it there, but obviously heavenly body on the back of the bomber jackets. And then, of course, here is an F-5. It's a P-38 reconnaissance version with that same idea. But you will see this particular theme throughout both the Pacific and the European theater, heavenly body. Arkansas Traveler, I guess it was a popular tune back in the day. Somebody told me it goes to the theme of carrying a bumblebee. I don't know. Okay. At any rate, that's supposedly how the tune goes, but you see this idea of Arkansas Traveler also replete. Again, it's a reflection of popular culture. What's big at the time, and that song obviously stuck with many air crews. And again, you see it in both theaters. Double Trouble. In fact, I think my tie has that on it today too, because I'm wearing my nose art tie. But this is all, again, one of the major themes you see again with regard to a constant theme. And here, of course, you got liquor and women. You know, men engaged in a forward area, thinking about what they like best, I guess, is liquor and women. So there's that. Shoo Shoo Baby was a popular song at the time. And again, you see lots of art that depicts that particular song itself, both on fighters, and in bombers. And this particular B-17 is in the U.S. Air Force Museum. As well as the Memphis Belle, the original Memphis Belle, is at the Air Force Museum. They redid her. They took her, stripped her all the way down, and built her back up, and she is absolutely resplendent in the Air Force Museum today. Lonesome Polecat, again, Little Abner take on that, was a popular meme at the time. And you can see here, this particular pilot had some problems. Might have been strafing a little bit too low that day, and Doug is playing into the ground, as it were. You can see here he's got a kill on his aircraft here. So again, they tell the story. And also in the 8th Air Force, actually in most of the Air Forces, each individual fighter group, and even the bombers themselves, but more so in the nose art, the fighter groups had very distinctive color codes. You could tell by looking at the cowl of an individual aircraft what fighter group he was with. And if you look at the two of the codes on the fuselage, you can tell what squadron he's from. These codes have meaning. These colors have meaning. And especially when you're at 20,000 feet and everything is going on, you need to have this kind of garish color so you can help identify each other. It's even hard enough to figure out who's a German and who's an American sometimes. As a matter of fact, when you see a lot of P-47s and early P-51s, they have a white stripe on the horizontal stabilizer. Why? Because to the gunner in a bomber, an ME-109 or an FW-190 looks a lot like a P-47 or a P-51. So to kind of help identify themselves, the Americans would paint white stripes on their horizontal stabilizers and their vertical stabilizers to kind of say, hey, don't shoot at me. And during D-Day, if you look at, again, our C-47, it's got those red or those black and white stripes on it. Same thing. Hey, I'm a friendly, don't shoot at me. So again, these things all have meaning. Let's take a look at some of the unit art that we have here. This particular one up on top, I like this 80th Fighter Group. It's called the Burma Banshees. Look at the skulls. Every one is different. One's got a mouth open, one's got a mouth closed, one's got one droop, one doesn't. It's kind of interesting. This particular unit right here, the 90th Bomb Group, called Pirates, all their vertical stabilizers had a little pirate with the cross bombs on it. And there's a picture of the whole squadron wearing masks, and they're all doing this thing, as part of a squadron photo. It's kind of funny how they identify with their art itself. VF-17, I talked about this before, and this is only a smattering of unit, folks. I can't go through all of them. Here you go, Jolly Roger flag on there, and you can see other planes of the squadron on there. This is being flown by a guy by the name of Lieutenant Ira Kepford, very famous naval avid. You can see he's got quite the extensive scoreboard on there, as does VF-17 itself as an organizational unit. I like the 43rd Fighter Group. You get these big garish tigers on their face. They flew in the Aleutians during the Aleutian campaign, so they don't get a lot of press. You hear about the flying tigers all the time, but these guys are really flying in the Alaskan wilderness where the weather is terrible. Okay, it's marshy, it's cold, fog rolls in, and not to mention you have these hurricane force winds called willowaws that will come in and harass the aircraft. Sitting on the ground, they'll flip them right over. So this particular group, you can see here in their airfield here, it's all mud covered and caked, but they put these kind of tiger-shaped faces on all of their aircraft, which I think is really quite interesting. This particular group had a commercial artist that worked for him. And what he did was, his name was Phil Brinkman, and they called themselves the Flying Zodiacs. So each aircraft of the squadron had a different zodiac painting put on it. And here's Aries, and there's Phil Brinkman right there cleaning his brushes. Here, Leo the Lion. Libra. You can see these are beautiful works of art. These aren't just something somebody slapped on the side. This took time and effort to draw this out. Scorpio, Pisces. And to speak to this particular art form and how beautiful it is, the fact is these planes are engaged in combat. And sometimes they don't come back. War bond art, what the heck is that? Well, during the war, a lot of people would actually do fundraisers, local schools, local cities, local counties, and buy an airplane for the Army Air Corps, slap their name on it, and that was the community's contribution to the war effort. And so these planes would actually carry the local, whatever, municipality or town that actually did. The one up top says McKinley Junior High. Junior high school students bought that airplane. For the Army Air Corps. And you see a lot of this, factories did this as well, and organizations did this. And how do you paint these things? Well, here's one approach. Especially in the Pacific. At least in England, you can go to a local store, maybe buy some paint, but in the Pacific, it's kind of hard because you're on a remote island. And so, it's interesting, this particular squadron right here is the same squadron Charles Lindbergh flew with. He wasn't supposed to fly, but he flew anyway. Okay. And he was appalled by the nose art. Didn't like it. Thought it was disgusting. It was kind of interesting. Okay. Let's talk about some personal nose art. Talking about the individual pilots themselves. And these are kind of interesting stories. Many of you may or may not have heard of Robert Olds. Robert Olds was he's from West Point, and he flew not only in the Second World War, but he also flew in Vietnam. And he's a very successful pilot in the European theater. And when he went to West Point, he had a classmate whose nickname was Scat. Don't ask me, that's what his nickname was. Every one of his planes is called Scat. All the way from Scat 1 through Scat 5, and even into the Vietnam War, Scat 17. Kept that theme throughout. Now, Rob's an interesting cat. Not only is he a pretty flamboyant guy, and in Vietnam he grew this handlebar mustache, which was out of regulations, but that's what Robin does. He married actress Ella Raines, which is pretty amazing. There's a guy, Air Force guy on an Air Force pay, marries a Hollywood starlet. But when he's in Vietnam, he's commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing. And he shoots down 4 North Vietnamese aircraft. Rumor has it he had 5, but he didn't want to get sent home. So he didn't claim the 5th one. It's a great story. Nobody really knows if it's true or not, but it makes for a great story. Okay? But here you go. He's carrying this tradition all the way through into his Vietnam days. Most of you know who Chuck Yeager is. He starts off with Glamorous Glenn, goes to Glamorous Glenn II, and then, of course, when he flies the X-1 and breaks the sound barrier for the first time, the X-1 is named Glamorous Glenn after his wife, Glennis Yeager. Neil Kirby. He's leading ace, P-47 ace in the Pacific Theater. You can see here he's awarded a Medal of Honor for 6 victories in one day, and unfortunately he dies. But his wife's a fiery redhead, so is mine. Okay, so if I was Neil Kirby, I understand why he named it Fiery Ginger. And notice this is Fiery Ginger 4th. So there was a 1 and a 2 and a 3, and this is the final iteration of it. If you go to the Air Force Museum, they actually found the tail of his actual aircraft in the jungle. Now it is in the museum today. You can see it next to this reproduction of his P-47. But again, reflecting the girl at home, as it were. George Preddy, 25 years old when he dies on Christmas Day in 1944. But you can see he names this plane Cripes Mighty, and this is the 3rd. So Cripes Mighty 1, which was a P-47. Then they transitioned to P-51s. You had Cripes Mighty II and Cripes Mighty III. And you can see here, it's black and white, but this is a blue field. And this was the representation of the 352nd Fighter Group. That's how you could tell who these planes were, or what group it came with. So again, it has meaning. You can see instead of having his kills lined up here, he has them on the cowling all the way down. It's kind of interesting how he did that. You can see his brother was serving in the war too and fell in the air, both buried together in Santa Bowl. 25 years old when he passed away. John C. Myers, again, same fighter group. Notice the blue. His aircraft, Petey II, Petey I. Now, what's interesting about John is that he actually comes Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force and head of Strategic Air Command. The guy went from a long range, from just being a fighter pilot to being a 4-star general. And the guy is very successful. You can see he's got 7 distinguished flying crosses, to include shooting down an Me-262, which is the first German operational jet that you've probably seen in history there. J.D. Landers, this one's my favorite. Out of all the planes, all of those are that I like, this one's my favorite. Okay, he flies a P-51 called Beautiful Doll. Okay, you can see the first iteration here. Of course, he flew both in the Pacific and in the European theater. Now, many of these are ground kills, not necessarily air-to-air kills, and there is a difference, but they still put him on their aircraft. And his aircraft, when he becomes the head of the 78th Fighter Group, has what I would call the ultimate expression of nose art, one of the most beautiful aircraft with one of the most beautiful paint jobs. Big, beautiful doll. And you can see he's got his kill markings here. He's got this checkerboard in the front, which is indicative of the 78th Fighter Group. It's outlined in red. The anti-glare panel is outlined in red. This is in big black letters with red outline on it. He's got some checkerboard kind of on the horizontal stabilizer, or the wing on the outside of the wing, and the vertical stabilizer was black. If you ever see the airplane, there are remakes that are flying around. It's absolutely stunning in color. I like this one. Now, Sergeant Glover flies these missions in a B-24, credited with his kill. But he only flies like 6 missions, and his career is cut short. Why? Because he claimed he was 16 years old when he enlisted in the Army Air Corps, which you could do because we needed manpower. They found out he lied. He was 14 years old. And he flew 6 missions before he actually got found out. And so a big-time operator, I think, fits with this teenager who was fighting for his country. He actually, when he becomes of age, he joins the Air Force and does a whole career in the Air Force subsequent to his tour in the European theater. Kind of a great story. There you go. Now, I've shown you a lot of different influences and depictions of nose art, but there's a great academic work done by this gentleman right here, Robert Brieux, in 1982, and I just happened to find it by accident. And he surveys like 1,500 pieces of nose art, and he classifies them on the types of, and by theater. And you can see here, category 1 is a female form, Category 2 is a neutral form, like maybe a saying or, location, home, that kind of thing. A male form, an animal form, or some kind of motif about the crew. And you can see what he finds in the depictions. In the ETO, about 43% are female forms, while in the Pacific Theater, 66% are females. I think it speaks to the fact that they're on remote islands as opposed to being in England. That's probably my guess, but I don't know that for a fact. 2, the neutral form, about less than 10%. The male form, 14 to 10%. Animal form, 13 or 9%. And then some kind of a motif. So you can kind of see a theme here with regard to the depictions themselves. Again, this is just a random sample source of 1,500 aircraft. If you were to expand it, you might get different numbers, but I think this is indicative of what you see in the collective for these depictions. And in conclusion, as I am running out of time here, I think these pieces of work are lovely. I think they are actually standalone works of art by themselves, removed from the history, removed from the aircraft themselves. They're expressions of men in war. What is important to these men? What is on their minds? I think it gives you a unique insight you wouldn't normally have without these graphic representations. And I think it provides a rich military legacy, because what do you see subsequent to this? Korea, Vietnam, even today. Not only on airplanes themselves, but you'll see it on armor vehicles, tanks, those kinds of things, because men engaged in combat want to express themselves. And going back to the slide, kind of thumb their nose a little bit at the hierarchy. I'll conclude with one great story about nose art and thumb your nose at the authorities. There's a B-24 that is flying from the United States to the North African theater. And the plane flies into this airfield at Natal, which is in Brazil. And on the nose art is a female form with a bare breast. Okay. Well, the base commander doesn't like this. And he instructs the aircraft commander, fix this. This is obscene, I don't want to have it. So the crew chief, like most crew chiefs are, not a problem, skipper, I got it. So he goes and he grabs some paint, and he puts a top on the female form. The crew's grumbling about this, but they take off anyway. And when they're in the air, the crew chief turns to the pilot and says, "Don't worry about it, skipper. I used water-soluble paints." So with that, I will conclude. I'm pretty much right on time, and I'll open the floor for any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So we do have a few moments for a Q&A. So if you are watching online, please place your questions within either the comment section on Facebook or within the chat on Vimeo. And here in person, just raise your hand and I will come and bring the microphone to you.
On your Martini aircraft,
Yes, sir.
they also had 2 ducks on the
Yes. Great question. I have no answer for you. I've been wondering that myself. So again, they have meaning, but sometimes it gets lost. And so I too struggle with it sometimes. There's a reason why it's on there, and sometimes it might be something, an inside joke. I do not know to answer your question. I apologize, but I would love to know myself. It's a legitimate, great question.
So we have an online question.
Okay.
Someone would like to know if there's any information known on a plane called Dog Days.
There is, if I may, top of my head, no, but I'm sure there is. What I would tell the online viewer, there are online databases that you can go to that will have not only the location, but the group and the squadron, who flew it. A lot of these units now have databases. They started them up in the 90s when these gentlemen were still alive. Of course, many of them have since moved on. But they are out there. So I would encourage that person to, there is a number of them. There's b24.web, there's NOSART. The primary source I would go to is the U.S. Air Museum in England. Especially the Imperial War Museum runs it. It's got a phenomenal database. If he's at 8th Air Force, fair enough. But there are a number of places online that you can find that might help you find that particular piece of NOSART. Thank you.
John, you had brought up the individuality of Americans versus Japanese
Mhm.
versus Soviet. Was this done to brag? The kill marks in particular. Was this done to intimidate? Was this done just as a scoreboard?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of more, not bravado, but showing your successes. You know, as you well know, it meant people in the military, we have ribbons, we get medals, we get things that are festooned on you to kind of show your accomplishments as a military professional. And I think that that's why you see that manifestation. And remember, or most of you haven't seen, but the number of aces that you see, at least in the U.S. Air Force, is only about 20% of the population. It is really a relatively small population. And I'll use the term meat eaters. Bad term, but this idea that these are the guys that are really taking it to the Germans. And so there is this kind of, hey, check me out. And like most fighter pilots, pretty arrogant. That's what you want. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. You know, I use that in a good term. And so it's a way for them to say, look, you know, look at me. And so, and again, I think that reflects when you look at the Japanese piece. You don't see it. I mean, you see some, of course, but not a lot, because it's more the collective and then the hierarchical thing too as well. Does that answer your question, sir? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
On one of the plane's kill markings, in addition to the German markings,
Mhm.
there was an ice cream cone and a skeleton.
Yeah. Okay, the ice cream cone usually means that, usually a depiction of a paratrooper, or maybe he flew a mission in support of, you know, a paradrop or something like that. I'm guessing, okay. And then the skeleton, I must have missed that one. I didn't see it. I couldn't.
Skeleton key.
Oh, skeleton key. Oh, you got me on that one. I'm going to put that one running with the ducks. Again, I know it means something. I just don't know. And again, that's why I find this so fascinating, because it's a lot of it's inside information. You got to be in the unit. So I can't answer that particular question. I apologize.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
The Russians had a red star for their kill marking
Mm.
rather than swastikas.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Again, just a different manifestation in how they tallied their things. And it's interesting too. The Russians, like the Americans, you see them in nice little rows. There's some mates that just kind of stuck them all over the place in a mishmash. And so it really is a cultural manifestation as opposed to a military one. And I don't have an explanation for it, but you're right. It's interesting that it's red as opposed to the swastika. Maybe they don't want to have swastikas festooned on their airplanes. You know, that might be part of it as well. They saw it as, you know, something beneath them. You know, but it is a good observation. Yes, sir.
And for our final question.
John, the attribution on one of those slides was the American Air Museum.
Yeah.
Where is that?
That's in the UK. If you go, the best place to go, for me, you go to Duxford in the UK. It is a magical place. It is a magical place. Not only do they have one Spitfire, they have like 10 Spitfires. And if you're lucky, you go there on the right day, they'll fly them all in a formation. It is absolutely phenomenal.
On the Memphis Belle.
Yes, sir.
Underneath the bombardier nose gunner.
Yeah.
It said Dinky Janie or something.
Yeah, a lot of times they would put either their name or their girlfriend's name or their nickname. Matter of fact, if you looked close enough on the door of the Memphis Belle, it says Stuka. That's their dog. They had a crew dog, and they put the crew dog on there. So again, these individual manifestations on the aircraft themselves. So I think, which makes it even more interesting because it's personalized now. It's not cut and dry military kind of stuff. So with that.
Perfect. Well, thank you, John,
Thank
for
you.
everything today. It was a fascinating lecture. Thank you to our audience for attending today's program. I encourage you all to continue to stay tuned to everything that's going on at the National World War II Museum. So take care.